Good afternoon and welcome to the NACo webinar on the U.S. Treasury's final rule for the American Rescue Plan Fund and the Fiscal Recovery Fund for America's County Government. My name is Matt Chase. I'm the Executive Director of NACo, joined by Aaron Hurley, who's our Deputy Legislative Director and our expert on the Treasury rule. So I want to thank you all for jumping on. We're going to give kind of a preliminary overview of our interpretation of the final rule. I want to start with a couple of general comments, and then I'll turn it over to Aaron to dig into the rule. So first, we want to express our appreciation to the U.S. Treasury and all the officials over there who worked with us on countless questions that our members put forth. I think we ended up submitting over 1,500 questions to Treasury on the interim rule, and want to thank you all for really digging into that interim final rule and providing very, very thoughtful feedback. Later today at 4 p.m. Eastern, U.S. Treasury will start their series of webinars and conference calls on the final rule, and you will be able to watch those. They will have a series of them, and I think it'll also be available online. So over the weekend, we spent a lot of time reading the 44-page executive summary of the rule, as well as the 437 pages that make up the final rule. As I said during the interim final rule, how I would start reading this document is actually from the back to the front. The last 40 or so pages of the rule, of the document, is the actual rule. And if you go from page 1 to about page 400, there's a lot of background, there's a lot of insight, and it's really important material. But if you start and you read the last 40 or so pages, I think it'll help you get to the meat of what Treasury is trying to say. So as we jump in, Aaron, I want to thank you for all of your effort and your leadership on this amazing journey. And want to say a huge thank you again to U.S. Treasury, but also to the NACo county officials across the country. We've got some major gains, some wins in this final rule, including, I don't want to steal all your thunder here, but the $10 million allowance for lost revenue that helps about 70% of all counties declare their allocation as, quote, lost revenue. It allows you to use it for more general uses. And there's a whole host of other clarifications. Is the rule perfect? No, there's some things in there that we wish we could have made more progress on, particularly around capital expenditures, but we're going to dig into that. And so why don't you start leading us through this presentation? And for the audience, I will interrupt Aaron a little bit and we'll have a conversation just to make sure we're highlighting a couple of the key points throughout the presentation. So Aaron, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So first and foremost, let's go over the key highlights of the final rule. So first and foremost, the key highlights. I think what's very important to know is that, first of all, the final rule isn't actually effective until April 1st of 2020. However, Treasury outlines that you can take advantage of the flexibility of the final rule, since there is a considerable amount of flexibility between the final rule and the interim final rule, but you are not required to do so. Regardless of what you choose to whether opt in and start spending under the final rule or maintain spending under the interim final rule, no matter what, your funds will not be recouped so long as, of course, you are in compliance with either the interim final rule and the final rule. Number two, a very key and very significant change within the final rule, as Matt mentioned, is that it does allow counties to use up to $10 million of your total ARP recovery fund allocation towards lost revenue, and therefore you can use it on the provision of government services. So that what this means really is that you no longer have to do a revenue loss calculation. Simply, you can just allocate up to $10 million towards that category and use it on any sort of government service. This was really huge, just given the fact NACo really was aggressive in our advocacy efforts in terms of getting this provision included. Folks may remember that there was a provision in another bill that was circulating on Capitol Hill, S3011, HR 5735, that NACo was very supportive of. So ultimately, we were very happy to see that Treasury did include this in their final rule. Also related to the revenue loss category is that the final rule actually improves that revenue loss calculation that counties can also take part in. If you do not decide to do the $10 million allocation for revenue loss, you can still calculate it. And there are actual new funding streams that you can include in that revenue loss calculation, which we will get into detail in just a minute. Also, we know that this was a huge question from counties over the last several months after the interim final rule was released. It's about capital investment project, capital infrastructure projects. So the final rule does provide clarification on which projects that you can use recovery funds to cover those costs associated with those projects versus ineligible uses, and some of the additional requirements if you do choose to spend your dollars towards capital expenditures. Also, another key highlight is in regards to populations that are either impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So again, we'll go into more detail about this within the specific section, but what you really need to know about this is that the final rule will allow you to provide services and support to a much broader range of populations in contrast to the interim final rule. So again, very happy to see that flexibility provided under the final rule. In regards to premium pay, there is also some administrative ease in actually providing premium pay to essential workers. Treasury also broadens the definition of what essential workers are as well. You can also use the recovery funds to not only rehire your local government staff to pre-pandemic levels. So again, similar to the interim final rule. However, now under the final rule, you can actually rehire your local government staff to above pre-pandemic levels to a certain percentage. Also, a new eligible expense under the interim final rule is that you can now use your recovery funds for the modernization of cybersecurity, specifically the modernization of hardware and software. Originally, under the interim final rule, you could only use your revenue loss dollars towards that. So now you can use your recovery funds, whether it's revenue loss or just your normal recovery funds. Treasury also brought in eligible projects for water and sewer infrastructure beyond those that were authorized under the interim final rule. So they actually added more projects outside of both the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And then finally, there is also additional projects that are eligible under the broadband infrastructure category to ultimately provide better connectivity to a broader population as well.
And Aaron, before you go on, lot to digest here.
Yeah.
We literally could take days to go through this, but some things are coming up in the chat that I want to get to, and I'm sure we'll repeat it over and over and over. So first of all, if you are for any county, any county can use up to their first $10 million of their total allocation as lost revenue, meaning you can use it for any governmental service, and we'll get into the exceptions. You cannot use it for rainy day funds, for pensions, for legal settlements, and you can't use it for actions that would be against COVID mitigation. But just to clarify again, we have about 2,100 counties, about 70% of all counties receive 10 million or less. You can now use that entire allocation as quote lost revenue. And you can start to use it now. Even though the final rule goes into effect April 1st, you can take advantage of the flexibility now. So you can use the interim final rule or the final rule now, even though it goes into effect April 1st.
Correct.
Sounds a little crazy, but that's the way it is. Second is with the lost revenue, and again, we're going to dive deeper into lost revenue, but I don't want to lose it, is Treasury did change the standard amount. So if you're a county that has more than $10 million and you want to go ahead and still calculate your lost revenue, Treasury went from using a default growth of 4.1% per year, and they increased their standard growth to 5.2% per year, correct?
Yep.
And we'll dive into that. So for those of you that have more than 10 million, you're saying, what about us? Hold on, we're going to get to that lost revenue. but Treasury did make a change from the 4.1% standard deduction or allowance up to 5.2%. All right, take us away.
Great, thank you. So before we get into the details of the final rule as well, I did want to mention just the day after Treasury released their final rule, they also did release both the report and user guide for the project and expenditures reports. So those are due specifically for counties that either have a population of 250,000 and above, as well as received above $10 million in recovery funds. Your reports are due at the end of this month, so July 31st. So Treasury did release exactly what sort of information will be required within those reports, as well as a user guide to help you throughout that process. I also do, as a final note, want to mention as well too, if your county is either below 250,000 in population or received less than 10 million in recovery funds, you are not required to submit that first project and expenditures report at the end of the month. You actually have until April 30th of 2022. So just hold tight for right now. You actually don't have a report to complete yet. It's not made available yet, but Treasury will be releasing that in the coming months. So this is just a broad overview. As a refresher, these are the categories in which counties can invest their recovery funds in. We all know the public health response, addressing negative economic impacts, replacing your lost revenue, now allocating up to that $10 million, providing premium pay, and then of course, investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So getting into the revenue loss category. So as you can see on the screen here, we have highlighted kind of the key features within the interim final rule that are a little bit different to that of the interim final rule. So as Matt and I have both mentioned a number of times now, really the key change here is that you can allocate up to $10 million of your total ARP recovery fund allocation towards lost revenue and use it for any sort of government service. However, if your county, of course, did have more than $10 million in revenue loss, you can still use the revenue loss calculation, again, with that difference from the 4.1% to the 5.1% when you are calculating your revenue loss. And again, with this new change in the final rule, this allows a little over 2,100 counties to allocate their ARP allocation towards revenue loss. And then when we're talking about the improvements to the revenue loss formula, you may remember that in the interim final rule, Treasury uses the definition, general revenue. They tie to the the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of general revenue. So what they did in difference to the interim final rule is that they included two new revenue streams in the general revenue definition. So namely, you can now include utility revenue in that calculation as well as liquor store revenue as well too. So those are two new funding streams that you can include in your revenue loss calculation. Also, in terms of calculating your revenue loss, you may remember that your county was supposed to calculate revenue loss on December 31st of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So now under the final rule, you can either choose to calculate your revenue loss on a fiscal year or a calendar year basis. However, you must pick and stay with one option when you do choose that. But again, some additional flexibility as well there. And then finally, you must adjust your actual revenue totals for the effect of tax cuts or increases that are adopted after January 6th of 2020. And then finally, just to reiterate, again, the revenue loss growth rate changed from that 4.1% to that 5.1%, which that's the percentage that you use in that revenue loss formula.
So Aaron, just before you pivot off that, again, we're getting some questions on this. One on for those that are calculating lost revenue, it's totally discretionary whether they want to include their utility revenue and if they have liquor store revenue. I know like in Montgomery County, Maryland, county owns liquor stores. They don't have to include the revenue, but if they do one year, they have to the next year. They have to be consistent.
Exactly, correct.
And same thing with the fiscal year versus calendar year. we had a lot of counties wanted to be on their fiscal year, not the calendar year. And so that was a great win. But once they pick a fiscal year versus calendar year basis to run their lost revenue, they have to be consistent. They can't pick fiscal year one year, calendar year the next. They just, once they pick one, they got to stay consistent.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So,
And I will say, people are stunned with the $10 million allocation. They're like, really? We've got a $10 million allowance? Yes, we're going to keep saying it over and over. That is the standard allowance. So we'll keep beating that drum.
definitely. So in terms of continuing on the replacing lost revenue piece. So after your county either calculates its revenue loss or decides to allocate up to that $10 million number, Treasury articulates that you can use this funding for any service that is traditionally provided by your government. So while we do provide you with some common examples of what Treasury outlines eligible uses are, really we want to stress that you should lean towards what we're saying you just cannot use the funds for, because you really can use it for any government function that your county typically does. So just very quickly running through some of the uses that Treasury does outline in the final rule is construction of school and hospitals, road building and maintenance, and any other infrastructure, health services, also general government administration, staff and administrative facilities, environmental remediation, as well as police, first responders, and other public safety services. And I also do want to point out the language in the parentheses is including the purchase of fire trucks and police vehicles, simply because we did receive a lot of questions about that over the last several months.
So Aaron, just a couple of quick questions. So if they already submitted their lost revenue calculation for the first year, can they change it? Will that be with their next report? Is that something we need to research further?
So if your county did, for example, if your county submitted your interim report at the end of August 31st of 2021, Treasury understood through NACo and hearing, of course, from you all that you may not have gotten around to actually calculating your revenue loss. So you had the option of putting 0 into that field, and then you were allowed to actually come back and you'll be able to change it in your next project and expenditure report. So again, either at the end of this month or April 20th as well. So you are allowed to, of course, recalculate it, especially now that growth rate adjustment has changed. So you will be able to change that in your first project and expenditures report.
And just remember that first report was interim.
Yes.
By definition, interim is temporary. And so you can go back in and change it. When can they, let's see here, I'm sorry, I've got a couple that came in. With the 5.2, is that for all the years, 2020, 2021, or is that April 1st, 2022 and moving forward? Meaning, is the change from the 4.1% to the 5.2% for all years, or was it moving forward? Does that make sense?
You would be able to use that. Yeah,
yes. Since the beginning.
Yes.
Since the beginning.
Yes.
So the 5.2% goes back to 2020, 2021.
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
Great.
Yes. So those are some of the examples that Treasury outlines in terms of being able to use lost revenue. But again, as I mentioned, really want to stress that you should focus on what you cannot use it for, kind of as your guide as you are thinking about investing the funds. So simply, again, you can use it for a very broad range of government services, but you cannot use it for rainy day funds or debt service. And we'll get into some more detail on the next slide here as well.
And as you get into that, Aaron, when do they have to choose between the fiscal year and the calendar year? Is that going to be their next reporting period?
Correct. Yep, that'll be in your next reporting period.
Okay.
So again, this kind of just outlines even more kind of additional clarification in terms of the revenue loss piece. So again, in terms of what you cannot use your revenue loss replacement for is extraordinary contribution to a pension fund, the debt service payment, that also includes tax anticipation notes, also known as TANs, rainy day or reserve accounts, also settlement agreement, judgment, consent decree, or a judicially confirmed debt, with some limited exceptions on that. Any sort of activity that conflicts with the purposes of the American Rescue Plan Act statute. So again, you need to make sure that uses of your funds don't conflict with any sort of COVID-19 mitigation practices that are in line with CDC's guidance and recommendations, and making sure when you are using the funds that it does not violate the awards and terms conditions or in conflict of interest requirements under the uniform guidance, which counties all have to comply with via Treasury's reporting requirements as well.
Yeah. So Aaron, just looking at the chat, we're probably going to have a separate webinar just on the lost revenue, because it feels like a change, but it's to our favor. So number one, just to restate it before you jump off to the next subject, if you said 0 under your interim report for lost revenue, you can still go back and change it in your next report, and you can still claim the $10 million standard allowance. Nobody is forced to take the 10 million. If you're a larger county that received more, you can take more.
Correct.
But if you're the 2,100 counties that receive 10 million or less, you can declare your whole allowance as lost revenue. There's a lot of questions in here around that. One of the key points before you jump off is that the general services, you can use it for any normal governmental program or service, except for those things that are on your slide right here.
Exactly. Yep.
So you don't have to go through the rest of the regulations and understand all the other nuances of the rule, except for to know you can't make extraordinary contributions to pensions, you can't pay debt service, you can't build a rainy day account, you can't pay off legal settlements unless a judge makes you do something related to COVID or ineligible use. And then where I would really, really warn people is your last two bullets. You still have to comply with federal uniform guidance, meaning you have to watch out for conflicts of interest, pay to play. You got to make sure you're following civil rights rules, Americans with disability, like general federal law.
Correct.
You can't, It's not the Wild West. You still have to follow normal federal law.
Exactly. Yes. And I also do want to note as well too, that, and we do have a slide on this a little bit later, but it's regarding the non-federal match requirement. And you can also, in addition to all of these examples up here on this slide, you also can use your revenue loss funds for non-federal match requirements as well too. But again, we'll get into more details around that in just a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, and Aaron, again, a lot of people are confused with all these rules that we're going to go through versus the lost revenue, particularly with capital infrastructure improvements and other things that normally wouldn't be eligible. We're going to keep saying it over and over, but that up to 10 million or whatever lost revenue you have, you can use for general government services.
Correct.
All right. I'll probably say it 10 more times, but keep going.
We will be having, in addition to this preliminary overview webinar, we also will be having, we are going to restart our information session series where we will actually do a deep dive into each one of these sections within the final rule as well too. So we'll be hosting those over the next several weeks as well for members.
Yep.
So moving on to the next section, which is public health and negative economic impacts. So some of the key new features within the final rule is first aid to impacted industries. So what the final rule does is that it really just outlines how you actually can designate an impacted industry and what are those eligible uses to support that impacted industry. Also, in regards to public sector capacity, I mentioned earlier in the key highlights slide, but you can rehire to pre-pandemic levels or up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. And then you can also use recovery funds to support staff retention, avoiding layoffs, and providing compensation to furloughed workers as well. And then capital expenditures, a lot of clarification in terms of how you can invest funds with that. Ultimately, Treasury does outline that eligible projects must respond to the pandemic and are proportional to impact. So again, that's a very key word when we're talking about it, is proportional as well. And there are some required written justifications for those capital expenditures as well, which we'll go into detail. So in this slide here, what we wanted to do was really outline, since public health and negative economic impacts, that's a huge category within the final rule. So what Treasury does is actually break it down into 6 different subcategories, as you can see on the screen. So public health, assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, and then public sector capacity. So when we're talking about the public health section, so one of the subcategories here is COVID-19 mitigation. So I won't go through each one of these bullets, but as you can see on the screen, broad flexibility in terms of how you can use funds for COVID-19 mitigation. Just a few to point out that are new under the final rule is transportation to reach vaccination or testing sites, as well as other prevention and mitigation services for vulnerable populations. Also support for prevention, mitigation, and other services in congregate living facilities. And then that last bullet there, it was also very big, and we were very happy to see this clarification included in the final rule, was that you can use recovery funds for both emergency operation centers, as well as emergency response equipment, specifically emergency response radio systems. So we were very happy to see that included in the final rule. Moving on to allowable medical expenses under the final rule. So these are expenses that you can provide to households, medical providers, or any other incurred medical costs. So that first bullet there, very important, is that you can use recovery funds for unreimbursed expenses for medical care, for COVID-19 treatment or testing. So that's uncompensated care costs, whether it be out-of-pocket costs, also to providers. So big that you can use recovery funds in that way. Also consistent with the interim final rule, you can use recovery funds for paid family and medical leave. You can also use funds for emergency medical response, and then also treatment of long-term symptoms and effects because of COVID-19. Behavioral health care, similar to the interim final rule, huge emphasis in terms of how you can invest recovery funds under this subsection. So you can use it to invest in behavioral health facilities as well as equipment. Another new eligible use is services for pregnant women or infants born with neonatal abstinence syndrome. You can also use recovery funds for peer support groups. So you can actually use recovery funds for 988, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, as well as other support hotlines as well. And then that last bullet there as well is that you can actually use recovery funds to expand access to evidence-based services for opioid use disorder prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery as well. Moving on beyond the public health section. So let's talk about the negative economic impact section and how that really changed. I think the key takeaway within this section, and again, I did mention it in the key highlights part at the beginning of this call, but what the final rule does is that it presumes that certain populations were either impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So what this means is that in contrast to the final rule, the interim final rule, is that counties were allowed to provide a broader range of services and support to populations that were specifically within qualified census tracts. So really what this does is that it just broadens the populations that you're able to provide services to. So Treasury ultimately in the final rule presumes that the following households and communities are impacted by the pandemic. So this is low or moderate income households or communities, any household that experienced unemployment, a household that faced increased food and housing security, any household that qualifies currently for the children's health insurance program, childcare subsidies, the Child Care Development Fund, or Medicaid. And then also any household that qualifies for the National Housing Trust Fund, if your county does want to provide affordable housing programs to that specific household, and then any student that is within a household that lost access to in-person education. So specifically, if you are trying to provide educational services within that household as well. And then moving on to the disproportionately impacted part of this. So you have the impacted and disproportionately impacted. So how Treasury defines disproportionately impacted is low-income households and communities, any household that's residing in those qualified census tracts that I mentioned earlier, households that qualify for certain federal benefits. So that includes the temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, which is the federal public assistance program, the supplemental nutrition assistance program, SNAP, which is the federal nutrition assistance program, Social Security, WIC, which is another nutrition support program specifically for women, infants, and children, Section 8 vouchers, and then LIHEAP, which is the low income home energy assistance program. And then finally, also households receiving services provided by tribal governments as well. So how Treasury also provides definitions for low-income households. So what does that really entail? So it's households that are at or below 185% of the federal poverty definition. Also, if the household has an income at or below 40% of area median income for its county. And then these last two bullets on the right side of the screen are very, very significant because ultimately what Treasury does is make it a little bit easier for counties to actually provide services to households. So what they say is that your county can actually use a default household size of 3 when it's easier to administer these services or funds. And ultimately, you can just presume that any household that is earning below $40,626 is disproportionately impacted and therefore eligible for services. So this is, again, very helpful in terms of administration of services to these households because you do not have to go by household in your reporting requirements. And then this slide here, going off of in addition to the disproportionately impacted households, Treasury also defines what an impacted household entails. So these are low or moderate income households. Again, similar to the disproportionately impacted, if the household experienced unemployment, increased food or housing security, again, qualifies for CHIP, childcare, et cetera. And then the National Housing Trust Fund, as well as any student that lost in-person education. And then on the right side of the screen, again, very significant in terms of how Treasury defines low or moderate income households. So it's income at or below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. If the income is at or below 65% of area median income, again, you are still allowed to use the default of a household of 3. And so what that means is any household that is earning below $65,000 is impacted and therefore eligible for those services. And for whatever reason, if you're having difficulty in terms of designating a household as either impacted or disproportionately impacted, you also have the flexibility to identify them yourselves through a few other steps that you would need to take. And this is simply just outlining, once you've identified a household that is either impacted or disproportionately impacted, what sort of services you can provide to them. So pay for community health workers to help ensure access to health and social services within that house, remediation of lead paint, primary care clinics, hospitals, integration of health services that ultimately will help address any sort of health disparities within the community, housing vouchers and assistance, investments in neighborhoods to promote improved outcomes. That was also similar under the interim final rule. This is actually new in the final rule, is that next bullet is that you can use recovery funds for improvements to vacant and abandoned properties. So for example, actually building like affordable housing or permanent housing strategies within those properties. And then of course, also similar to the interim final rule, services to address any sort of educational disparities. And then finally, you can use recovery funds for the construction of schools and also purchase other educational equipment or facilities as well too.
So Aaron, got a lot of questions. I'm going to let you take a little pause here. One, on the slides, we will be sending the slides out today.
Yep.
We're literally been working on these slides up to the start of this event. So we will get those out to you, and apologize that we weren't able to get to them in advance. We will also update them as we continue to work through the rule with Treasury and as we get feedback from the members. So just a couple of quick questions before you jump off this. One is just to remind folks, it's more of a statement, that Treasury says for behavioral health activities, you can determine the general public as eligible. So this slide here, where you're talking about impacted and disproportionately impacted households, for behavioral health purposes, you can actually treat the broad public as eligible.
Correct.
You don't
Yes.
have to differentiate. And we've had a lot of questions about that from counties. So, okay, let's, EOCs, it's a new question. I will come back to that in a second.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, and just on the behavioral health part of this, I do just want to make a distinction between the public health section within the final rule and the negative economic impact section of the final rule. So the public health, behavioral health, again, that applies to all residents. You can use funds in that way. Simply the negative economic impact section does make the differentiation between impacted versus disproportionately impacted, but don't try to avoid looping in the behavioral health care into this negative economic impact section.
Good point. Good point. And then before you jump off, around childcare assistance, does it have to be for impacted, disproportionately impacted, or can it be for anybody? On childcare.
For childcare, in terms of how, I think I might need to know more in terms of exactly what the county is hoping to do. But for example, you can use the recovery funds to build new childcare facilities. Also, in terms of also investing in terms of childcare assistance, there's a whole part within the public sector capacity. You can use recovery funds to cover transportation expenses as well as childcare expenses for someone that is going back to work as well.
I guess one of the questions is maybe, do all those income guidelines matter? We know for childcare, it includes all the impacted and disproportionately impacted. Can you go beyond that?
I'll double check
Okay.
within the final rule, but I think
And I see Rachel on our team is on there, so she may be able to answer that as we get into it.
this bullet on the last bullet on the right side of this screen, again, that gives you counties the flexibility to designate additional households as impacted or disproportionately impacted.
Okay.
So you don't necessarily, you do have those thresholds, the percentage thresholds, but you do have flexibility in designated, childcare assistance for additional households as well.
And one last thing on the household income, on the disproportionately impacted, what Treasury was trying to do in this final rule is actually make more people eligible.
Correct.
So this part of the rule is probably the most dense and has a lot of background in it. But the spirit of what Treasury was trying to do with some of these changes was make it easier for the county to determine who was eligible. As you're going to get into, it includes a list of presumptive, like TANF, SNAP, WIC, Section 8 housing, LIHEAP. These are a lot of federal acronyms, but they're giving you some pre-qualified communities. And so just remember, the spirit is they're trying to make it easier for you to assist your communities.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Okay, moving on to the next subsection of negative economic impacts. So of course, in addition to providing assistance to households, you can also provide assistance to small businesses that were financially impacted because of the pandemic. In the final rule, Treasury does define what a small business is. So what they say is that a small business will have no more than 500 employees and is independently owned and operated, and is also not dominant in its field of operation. They also provide a definition of what an impacted small business is. So that includes if the small business had decreased revenue, also if they experience any sort of financial insecurity, increased costs. For example, if they needed to buy any sort of equipment to help with social distancing, if they had needed to adjust capacity to weather financial hardship, as well as any sort of challenges covering payroll, rent or mortgage, and other operating costs as well. So in terms of eligible uses, you would be able to provide loans or grants to mitigate any sort of that financial hardship. So you could provide support for payroll and benefits, costs to actually retain employees, any sort of mortgage, rent, utility, and operating costs as well. And then also technical assistance, counseling, and other services to support any sort of business planning as well. Moving on to nonprofits, you can also provide assistance to nonprofits. And how Treasury defines a nonprofit is a 501c3 or a 501c19 tax exempt organizations. So similar to how does Treasury define an impacted nonprofit? Very similar to what an impacted small business is. Again, revenue, financial insecurity, increased costs, et cetera. They also provide a definition of what a disproportionately impacted nonprofit is as well. So that first piece is very important. So it's any nonprofit that is operating in a qualified census tract, a QCT, or operating in a tribal government or a US territory. And again, in terms of eligible uses, similar to small business, it's the loans or grants to mitigate financial hardship, technical or in-kind assistance, or other services to mitigate the negative economic impacts of COVID-19. Now, moving on to aid to impacted industries. So what the final rule does is it actually states what an industry can be or how an industry can be designated as impacted. So it outlines two ways. So first is, of course, if the industry is in the travel, tourism, or hospitality sectors, therefore, Treasury presumes that that industry was impacted. So similar to the interim final rule. However, what is new under the final rule is that if an industry is outside of the travel, tourism, or hospitality sectors, Treasury says that the industry is impacted if it experienced at least an 8% employment loss from its pre-pandemic levels, or if the industry is experiencing comparable or worse economic impacts as tourism, travel, and the hospitality industries as of the date the final rule was published. So last week, January 6th. You also have the flexibility to define industries under the interim final rule. And then in terms of actually providing aid to impacted industries, you can only provide aid to businesses and attractions that were operating prior to the pandemic and were affected by the closures. So you cannot provide assistance to businesses that were opened or were not operating prior to the pandemic. Now, moving on to the restoring the public health capacity, or excuse me, public sector capacity. This section.
Aaron, sorry, go back for a second. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with you and the questions. So one of the questions around the businesses.
Oh, yes.
Is can you help new businesses? And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also help them if the startup costs have increased due to COVID.
Correct.
With inflation, maybe now they have new COVID mitigation strategies and physical improvements that they need to their storefront or their restaurant or their business. The county can actually help them with the difference between the cost before pre-COVID and now, and they can help startups.
Correct, exactly. And my apologies, everyone. I must have missed this slide right here, but this is exactly what Matt is talking about. These are, in addition to impacted small businesses, Treasury also has a definition for disproportionately impacted small businesses. So it's a small business operating in a QCT, tribal governments, US territories, but then you'll see that there are additional eligible uses that you can use to support these small businesses. So as Matt mentioned, rehabilitation of commercial properties. So that's storefront improvements, facade improvements, again, technical assistance, also supporting business incubators, and grants for the startup or expansion costs as well. And then support for micro businesses, including any sort of childcare and transportation costs. So again, that just noting that childcare piece as well for those disproportionately impacted small businesses too. So moving on to restoring public sector capacity, which actually was expanded on a lot in between the interim final rule and the final rule. Again, and this is very, very helpful, especially given the fact that the hit that the public sector workforce took during the pandemic, namely, of course, county governments. So what Treasury outlines in their final rule in terms of how you can use recovery funds is that you can use it for payroll and covered benefits for public health, public safety, healthcare, human services, and similar employees of the county government. Again, I've mentioned this several times, but you can use the funds to both rehire public sector staff to pre-pandemic levels or above with that 7.5% limitation. And then in terms of actually both retaining and supporting the public sector workers, you can provide additional funding for employees who experience that payroll reduction or were furloughed during the pandemic. You can also use the funds to help ensure that you are maintaining the current compensation levels. If, for example, your county or business had revenue loss, you can also use the recovery funds to provide worker retention incentives. So again, it kind of has to be that we're bringing that word back in proportional, but you need to ensure that it is a reasonable increase in compensation and it is just additive to the employee's regular compensation. And then you can also use the funds to cover any sort of administrative costs associated with administering, with the hiring support and those retention programs that I just went through. And then effective service delivery, I'll get into details in terms of eligible uses in just a second. On this slide here, simply, we just wanted to outline, because there have been several questions over the past couple of months. What is the definition of a public safety, public health, and human services employee? So on the screen here, you can just see all of the examples that Treasury provides in terms of those staff that you can use the recovery funds to cover their payroll costs, benefits, et cetera.
Aaron, just a couple of things before you move on. We're going to go back to the business section a little bit. And I know you got a lot left to cover in public sector, but so a couple of key points. The way the Treasury money was allocated was per capita, meaning each county got money based on the number of people within the county. So the county really needs to invest its money within its county. And you can work on regional projects, but when you work on regional projects, you need to make sure that your county is benefiting in proportion to how much the county is investing.
Correct.
People are asking about small businesses. Can they invest in small business owners that don't live in the county, but maybe the business is in the county, or vice versa? So they need to be really careful that the money that they're investing goes to benefit the residents of their county.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly. Yep.
So that's one thing. For those that are asking questions around business loans, and I would say any loan that you give out using the Treasury money, there's a whole set of rules that Treasury has around loans. So if you are starting a small business loan program and they're not grants, but you're actually getting repaid, we're seeing this in small business. We're seeing it in housing where people want to create affordable housing trust funds or revolving funds. All I would say is there are specific sections of the rule around loan programs. And more importantly, the county should really study the overall uniform guidance and the regulations around loan programs, because it's a little trickier and it'll take more than we have time right now to do that. I'm going to flag for you just to think about as you move on is there's a lot of questions around emergency operations centers, around jails. And so we're going to come back to that, but I just wanted to flag that for you as you're thinking about the rest of the presentation.
Definitely. Just to the point for the emergency operations centers, that would be an allowable use in terms of how you can use the recovery funds. and we'll talk about the capital expenditure section in just a minute or so, but when you're thinking about eligible uses for your capital expenditure projects, actually looking through the different sections within the final rule, for example, public health, negative economic impacts, because Treasury actually does list eligible capital infrastructure projects under each one of those sections as well. But those centers would be, and it clearly articulates that actually within the public health section as well. Okay, so back to the public sector capacity. So in terms of rehiring to those pre-pandemic levels, you have two options. So the first one is very easy. Simply hire back all of the whatever amount of full-time employees you had prior to the pandemic on January 27th of 2020. The second option that you have is, again, hire above the pre-pandemic levels of up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline. So if you do want to hire above your pre-pandemic baseline, you need to complete the following steps that you can see on your screen. So it's really almost like, I guess it's somewhat, if you wanted to equate it to the revenue loss formula, you can, but you do need to do a calculation. So it just very simply, all you have to do, identify how many employees your county, business, et cetera, had on January 27th of 2020, multiply that number by the pre-pandemic baseline by 1.075. So that's your adjusted pre-pandemic baseline. Then you identify the county's budgeted full-time employees level on March 3rd of 2021. So that's your actual number of full-time employees. And then you subtract the actual number of full-time employees for that adjusted pre-pandemic baseline to determine how many full-time employees you could actually cover with the recovery funds. And then when you are rehiring staff, note that you do not have to hire for the same role that existed to pre-pandemic. So you have flexibility in terms of actually what roles that you would like to rehire.
So Aaron, on that one, people shouldn't overthink it.
Yes.
That bottom one looks a little confusing, but again, it's pretty simple as you just explained. You can go back and look at your budget on January 27th, 2020, how many FTEs you had, and you can hire back. Or if you want to increase your capacity, they're allowing you to do it with the 7.5% inflation adjustment, if you will. That formula looks a little complicated on the screen, but if you pull out the final rule along with the summary guidance, it's pretty self-explanatory. You can walk through it.
Yes.
So don't be intimidated by it.
Definitely. So within the restoring public sector capacity, there's also effective service delivery. So while this isn't necessarily in regards to personnel, you can use recovery funds to improve the administration, efficacy of public health, and economic programs. So this is similar to the interim final rule, but there's just some additional clarification. So what does that mean? You can use recovery funds for program evaluation, any sort of data analysis resources to gather, assess, share, and use data, technology infrastructure to improve access to and user experience of government IT systems, any sort of community outreach and engagement activities. And then in terms of your administrative needs, you can use recovery funds for backlogs caused by shutdowns, for example, court case backlogs, and then also technology infrastructure to adapt government operations to the pandemic. So, for example, if you need video conferencing software, data, case management systems, you can use recovery funds for any of those uses or any of those costs. So moving on to the capital expenditures piece of this. The interim final rule does provide a lot of clarity in terms of how you can use recovery funds for capital expenditures. First and foremost, and this is the same as the interim final rule, but whatever capital project that you're investing in, it must be related to public health and or the negative economic impact and be proportional to the impact caused. Same as the interim final rule, there's no pre-approval required for your capital expenditures. Simply your county just needs to read the final rule and make sure that it's in compliance. Then Treasury did add in this part for the final rule to ultimately ensure that the expenditure is eligible, counties will be required to write a written justification for the capital expenditure, depending on how much your project actually costs. So it could either be equal to or greater than $1 million. And it will include the following information. So you will need to provide a description of harm or need that would be addressed because of this capital expenditure, explanation of why the capital expenditure is appropriate, for example, or also why your county's existing resources are inadequate for this capital project. And then finally, you will also need to provide a comparison of 2 other proposed capital expenditure projects against the one that you would like to propose as well too. So on this slide here, this is simply just a table that lays out what sort of requirements in terms of that written justification piece you will need to do if you are investing your funds in this way. So as you can see, the cost of your capital expenditure project actually guides what you will be required. So if your project is less than $1 million and it is clearly an eligible expense as outlined in Treasury's final rule, there is no written justification that's required for you. So no need to do that. If your project is greater than or equal to $1 million, but less than $10 million, and is clearly outlined as an eligible expense to Treasury, you will be required to write a written justification, but you do not need to submit as part of your reporting requirements. But in contrast, if it's not a clearly outlined eligible expense in the final rule, and again, you're between 1 and 10 million, you will need to do a written justification and also submit that in your reporting requirements. And then $10 million or more, no matter what, you will need to write a written justification for that project and include it in your reporting to the Department of Treasury. And then on this slide here, these are the clearly outlined eligible capital expenditure projects and the ineligible capital expenditure projects that Treasury outlines in the final rule. So on that left side of the screen, I mentioned this earlier, but all of these bullets are listed in either the public health or negative economic impact section of the final rule and demonstrate what sort of projects you can invest in. So again, that long list: schools, childcare facilities, medical facilities, temporary medical facilities, emergency operation centers. We had a question about that. Behavioral health facilities, affordable housing and permanent supportive housing, primary care clinics, hospitals, and then improvements to vacant and abandoned properties. Then in terms of the ineligible capital expenditures, it's construction of new correctional facilities, construction of new congregate facilities, and then construction of convention centers, or stadiums or other larger capital projects.
So Aaron, let's spend a little time on this again. And I know you've already covered it, but I want to just hammer this home. For the list of ineligible capital expenditures, there's some rationale that Treasury gave, particularly around new correctional facilities, new congregate facilities. And so there's a little confusion here where one, stress the term new.
Yes.
So we're getting a lot of questions about jails, about courthouses, general county facilities. You can retrofit and you can build new, but when it comes to new correctional facilities, what Treasury was saying is a couple of things. One is the timelines are really tight, and you have till December 31st, 2024 to obligate all the money, and December 31st, 2026 to spend it. So for these larger projects, especially things like stadiums and some of these convention centers that are multi-year, Treasury is saying you probably won't have the time. Number two is the cost benefit analysis that you went over. That what they're saying is if the community and the county put on their thinking cap, there is probably a better way to retrofit or to find another facility, an existing facility that can be retrofit or another facility that you can revamp rather than build new. So it's that cost benefit analysis that Treasury is saying you're really going to have to prove why something new would be better than fixing something that you already have.
Correct. And this also
and it's speed, right? Because
yes.
this is a pandemic, and they're saying we want you to provide services to residents now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
The now piece is very important. Also, again, just to reiterate, you can absolutely expand upon your jails, what correctional facilities, your whatever you want. You can definitely expand on those current facilities.
And, this is mixing and matching capital expenditures a little bit with some previous things about abandoned property.
Mhm.
Can you remove unsafe buildings? Yes.
Mhm. Yep.
The key with the abandoned properties is to make sure if you are building housing, for example, that you're not tearing down low-income housing and putting in $5 million housing.
Yeah.
That they want to make sure if you're tearing down low-income housing or moderate to low-income housing, you're replacing it across the county with a net gain.
Exactly.
That you're not replacing it. So again, the spirit of the rule is really important to understand what they're doing.
Absolutely.
For renovating and repairing correctional facilities, again, you can do it.
Yep.
It's the new that they're really putting a pause on, especially because of the scale and the speed that it would take to build those new ones.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
We're gonna have a million questions around jails.
So moving on to the premium pay section. So you are still, of course, allowed to provide premium pay. So what that is an additional $13 per hour to essential workers on top of their regular hourly rate. And then also you can provide lump sums up to $25 million per employee. So changes from the interim final rule. Under the interim final rule, counties were able to submit a written justification to Treasury to ensure workers that weren't listed to receive premium pay could receive premium pay. So simply what the final rule does is actually it allows counties to award premium pay to workers that are not exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provision without submitting a written justification. So again, it streamlines in terms of which workers that you can provide premium pay to. And then it also clarifies on types of eligible premium pay. So for example, you can now allocate premium pay in installments or lump sums. So this could be monthly, quarterly, however your county would like to do it. Premium pay can also be awarded to, or the rule clarifies this, be awarded to hourly, part-time, or salaried or non-hourly workers. So again, just clarification on that. And then also a last point is that volunteers cannot receive premium pay.
And what about elected officials? We're getting a lot of questions about elected officials for premium pay.
No, elected officials are not eligible to receive premium pay. And then just since this is called out on the right side of the screen, but same allowable use in terms of premium pay being able to be retroactive as well. So you can provide premium pay all the way back to January 27th of 2020. In terms of determining eligibility for premium pay, so we did not outline all of the categories of essential workers, how Treasury defines an essential worker. So, but the first step ultimately is that you have to make sure that the individual is an essential worker. But they definitely brought in the very many groups that are eligible to receive premium pay. Okay, of course, first and foremost, same as the interim final rule, any work that's performed by the employee of a state, local, or tribal government. They also added in election workers, dental care, any sort of solid or hazardous waste removal, and the list goes on. Added many different positions within that. Once you have identified the individual as an essential employee, of course, you also need to verify that this individual performs essential work. That includes work involving regular in-person interactions or physical handling of items. That's the exact same as the interim final rule. So a person would not be performing essential work and therefore not eligible for premium pay if they were performing work at a residence, were teleworking, et cetera. And then that third step, which is new, is that you will have to confirm that premium pay responds to workers performing essential work during the public health emergency. So simply what you have to do in that instance, so this is who would be eligible, determine the average annual wage for county employees, and it has to be below a certain threshold. And then any employee normally eligible for overtime as non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act that I just mentioned, those overtime provisions. And then if a worker does not meet any of those above criteria, that's when the county would have to submit written justification to Treasury. But there is, I want to emphasize, there's presumptive allowance for premium pay here. Moving on to water and sewer infrastructure. We were very excited to see the changes under the final rule. So key features in the final rule is that there are new eligible water and sewer projects. So you may remember under the interim final rule, the eligible projects that you could invest recovery funds in were those that were eligible under the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So the final rule actually provides additional eligible projects, including a broader set of lead remediation projects. So this is like fixtures, internal plumbing in schools and childcare facilities. You can use the recovery funds for culvert repair, residential wells, as well as certain dams and reservoirs. And simply on this screen here, we just outline all of the new eligible water and sewer projects. So as you can see, very, very, very robust. So again, I do want to call out the culvert repair. There's additional stormwater infrastructure that you can invest in now. Also, any sort of infrastructure that improves access to safe drinking water. Again, the dam and reservoir rehabilitation, and then a lot more around lead remediation as well. And then the last section within the final rule, broadband infrastructure. Similar to the water and sewer infrastructure, the final rule also does provide a lot of flexibility and broadens eligibility for projects under the final rule. So under the final rule, counties were actually required to invest in households and businesses without reliable wireline. And so they stated within the interim final rule, that's 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. And so what the final rule does is allows counties to invest in locations without reliable wireline of 100 megabits download speed and 20 megabits upload speed. So outlining this kind of new flexibility. Treasury says typically you can go through 3 steps to determine if a project or a residence is eligible to receive a broadband project, or you can invest in a broadband project. So first is that you identify an eligible area for investment. So going back to what I just stated, counties are encouraged to prioritize projects that are designed to serve locations that don't have access to the reliable wireline of 100 megabits download speed and 20 megabits upload speed. However, beyond that threshold that they identify in the final rule, you actually have a lot of flexibility to define what a community in need is. So examples of need include lack of access to a reliable high-speed broadband connection, lack of affordable broadband, and then lack of reliable service. So again, just because a household or business doesn't maybe necessarily go within that threshold, you have very, very broad discretion in terms of investing in certain areas within your county. And then number 2, your county, in terms of designing a project to meet high-speed technical standards, this is fairly similar to the interim final rule, but projects are required to meet or exceed 100 megabits download speed, 100 megabits upload speed. However, due to either excessive costs or because of the geographical location your county's in, you do have flexibility. So you can also invest in projects that have a wireline of 100 megabits download speed, 20 megabits upload speed. So you do have that flexibility. And then finally, the rule also does require that there can be some sort of enrollment in low-income subsidy programs. So specifically, any sort of household that is currently enrolled in FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program, and also ensuring that whatever project that you do provides access to broad-based affordability program to low-income consumers as well. And then the non-federal match requirements and cost share requirements that I mentioned that we would go over. So to reiterate, funds available under that revenue loss eligible category may be used to meet non-federal cost share or matching requirements of other federal programs. So that includes the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund. However, these funds cannot, even if they're in the revenue loss category, these funds may not be used for the non-federal share of the state's Medicaid or CHIP programs. That's the Children's Health Insurance Program. And then finally, for the recovery funds that are outside of that revenue loss eligible category, they cannot be used for the non-federal match or cost share requirement of other federal programs, other than those that are actually specifically provided by statute. So this actually includes certain broadband deployment projects, as well as certain projects under the recently enacted Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act.
And that's mainly broadband and the Bureau of Reclamation projects
Exactly.
there. So just on the non-federal share under revenue allowance or a revenue loss allowance. So for Medicaid and CHIP, some counties often have to provide a non-federal share to help the state match the federal money. So this prohibition would include counties could not use their revenue loss to match Medicaid or CHIP. It's not just state government. It would also include counties.
Yes, correct.
All right. I've got to keep going.
Okay.
And I've got a bunch of questions that are flying in.
All right, perfect. And then this is, I believe, our last slide, but now just finally defining what the ineligible expenses are. So the final rule does really just maintain the interim final rules restriction on use with additional clarification. So we all know that first and foremost, pension funds. The final rule clarifies that the prohibition of extraordinary contributions to pension funds applies to all recipients except for tribal governments. So again, pension funds. So simply you can't take a lump sum of your recovery fund and put them into a pension fund. And then other restrictions we've talked through a little bit, but you cannot use recovery funds for debt service, legal settlements, or judgments, deposits into rainy day funds or financial reserves. And then there is the final rule does clarify additional restrictions. And we talked about this a little bit before, but you cannot use the funds in a way that undermine COVID-19 mitigation strategies in line with the CDC guidance. And then you can also not use funds that would violate the uniform guidance or interest requirements and other laws as well. And then that final piece, which applies only to states and territories, but it's the net reduction in revenue. So you're not allowed to use recovery funds to directly or indirectly offset reduction in net tax revenue. And that's just a repeat of, again, new reporting guidance, which NACo will also be sending out more communication on. But again, those are due at the end of this month for those counties, as you can see on the screen as well.
So Aaron, we're having a lot of conversation here in the chat, particularly around the premium pay for elected officials. And my understanding was Treasury was kind of silent about that. We asked them about it more in our conversations. We probably need to get that in writing or to cite the specific areas. It looks like some counties did provide their elected officials with premium pay. There's a broader conversation around that. Really, there's some philosophical, I guess, disagreements or opinions on this. So we can get some clarity around, let's make sure that elected officials aren't eligible. And also we'll get more details on that.
Yes, definitely.
So on election equipment, that is allowed under lost revenue since a typical general service.
Yes.
What about beyond the lost revenue allocation? Was there any mention about election equipment that you can remember?
There was not any mention of election equipment beyond the revenue loss part, but we can also, of course, follow up with that. And I should have noted as well too, in addition, of course, to this national call that we are doing right now, and the ones that will be following this one, we will be coming out with a very in-depth analysis of the final rule too, hopefully within the next week or so. And all of this information will also be available to you all that way.
Yeah. And on the congregate settings, the congregate facilities, we're getting a lot of questions around that, particularly like nursing homes. And there is some language in there that Treasury explains their rationale around congregate settings,
Mhm.
saying that the best mitigation strategy, in their opinion, is testing, mask requirements, and vaccinations.
Yes.
And that would be an example of a cheaper, faster alternative to building a new nursing home.
Correct.
It would be much better to do testing, masking, vaccinations. That's what Treasury is saying.
Yes.
So again, it goes back to anytime you're doing capital expenditures, there's the first line of eligibility, and then there's the second test of, are there better alternatives than to spending all this money on a major capital infrastructure
Exactly.
expenditure?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so we have spent about an hour and 20 minutes. There are a bunch of questions in here, including about volunteer firefighters for premium pay. Again, Treasury was crystal clear that no volunteers may receive premium pay. Now, Treasury does explain in the public sector workforce section where they allow you to increase your staffing, that there are ways to look at making them paid firefighters
Mhm.
if you wanted to bring them on staff as either part-time or full-time employees or
Mhm.
other different levels of status that counties may have. But essentially, because of the term volunteer, which means you're not paid, that you can't provide premium pay.
Exactly. And the Treasury actually does provide a response to this exact comment in the final rule, kind of just doubling down on that again.
Great. All right, we have a lot of questions. We are going to respond to them the best we can. Around administrative expenses, for example, there's a uniform guidance. You can use these funds for administrative expenses. They need to be reasonable. They need to follow the uniform guidance. Also on direct versus indirect rates, basically the key is to be consistent. You can't charge direct rates and then indirect the next quarter. Like, you need to be consistent in how you would do that, just like you would under a grant. So we can provide more guidance on that as we move forward. But this is the first run through, and we'll try and get answers to everybody as much as humanly possible. So thank you again.
Thank you.